Today we're going to look at another question that's been set in that kind of builds off the last one. The last one that we looked at yesterday had to do with why did God, who knew all things, why did he create humanity knowing that humanity would fall, and why has he allowed human beings through every stage of life, every dispensation, from the time in Eden all the way to the end of the age, end of time. Why has God allowed these human beings to rebel against him? And God knew these things would happen. God knew the nature of people, and yet God allows these things. And why does that happen that way? Well, we looked at that yesterday, but here's a second question that's been sent in that really is very similar. It says, how do we have free will if God already knows and essentially planned the whole thing? So that's a good question. Do we have free will? And what exactly does that mean? If God knows all things and God has planned all things, then what is our responsibility? Now, let me answer that by, we'll eventually go to Acts chapter 2 if you want to turn there. But let me give you three basic approaches to trying to understand the sovereignty of God and the free will of humanity, or the responsibility of humanity. Three big theological schemes. First of all, there's Calvinism. Calvinism majors on the sovereignty of God, that God is in charge of all things. God controls all things. Nothing happens beyond his will. Nothing ever thwarts his will. Nothing is beyond his sovereign control. This is so even the big problem, I think, one of the big questions that Calvinism has to address is, how does evil factor into the picture? If God is sovereign and control over all things, does that mean that he is the author of sin and evil? The true Calvinist, the one who understands their position, would say no, God is not the author of sin. Scripture teaches that. And yet somehow the sovereign God of the universe has allowed sin to infiltrate his world. How is that possible in a sovereign God? That is not an easy answer, a question to answer, as you can imagine. And is God, under Calvinism, is God fatalistic? Is everything already mapped out so that every detail of life has already been mapped out before the beginning of time by God? Am I holding my Bible in my left hand right now because God foreordained that before the beginning of time? These are questions that come up that are very difficult to process and understand. And I'm not sure anyone has a perfect answer to the questions like that. And so there's the other side of that, and that is the view of Arminianism. The Arminian believes that God knows all things. He knew all things that would happen, but he doesn't control all things. And to a certain degree, that is trying to protect the integrity of God, so that God is not the author of sin. And it allows for human beings to express their free will to freely sin without God being responsible for that in any way. But it doesn't totally answer the questions, because God still knew these things under the Arminian system, even if he doesn't control them. So he knew that you and I would sin in certain ways. He knew Adam and Eve would fall. He knew the sinfulness of humanity throughout the ages. He knew those things before the beginning of time. And although he may not control the fact that I'm holding my Bible in my left hand, he knew, according to the Arminian system, before the beginning of time, that I would be sitting here in front of this camera, saying these words, holding my Bible in my left hand, trying to explain these things. That still does not solve the problem of how can the all-knowing, sovereign God allow these things, even if he doesn't control these things. It doesn't answer all of our questions. So another view has come up in more recent years called open theism, or sometimes process theology. And that's the idea that God knows all things knowable, but he doesn't know the future. God doesn't control the past or the present, but he knows them perfectly. He knows that this very moment that I am reading my Bible, looking at my Bible, holding it in my left hand, he knows the sinfulness throughout all the planet at any given moment, and he can anticipate what will happen in the next few moments or the next week or the next year, but even God cannot infallibly know the future. So we're right now facing an election year coming up, And we would know then that God knows the future, knows the present, but he doesn't know the future. Even God doesn't know who is going to be president of the United States, although he can have a pretty good idea. So that's open theism. All of them fall short to some degree of full understanding. The last one, I believe, is heretical. But as we look at Acts chapter 2, we find these words in verse 23. It says, "This man," speaking of Jesus, "delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to the cross by the hands of lawless men and put him to death." Here we have in one verse the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of humanity. God foreordained that Christ would go to the cross, but humanity put him on the cross. How does that fit? How does the responsibility of God and the responsibility of God and responsibility of man come together? Certainly in ways that are beyond our understanding. God is sovereign. Scripture teaches that clearly. Man makes responsible choices. He's not a puppet. That's also taught clearly in Scripture. Bringing those together are extremely difficult. I want to talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. Hope you can join us.